Okay, colleagues, we are ready to start. My name is Balakrishna Visupati. I'm the chairperson of a not-for-profit trust based in India called Forum for Law, Environment, Development, Governance, in short, FLEDGE. Welcome to this particular webinar. This webinar is the first in a series we are now planning to organize to support actions related to the design and development of the future global biodiversity framework. And for those of you who are familiar with the biodiversity discussions, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, where 196 countries are currently beginning to discuss a 10-year strategic framework for the convention beginning 2021 to 2030. And discussions are underway to define the strategic plan, the goals and objectives, as well as define a set of targets that will provide the necessary guidance and support for countries to achieve the global goal of biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and equitable access and benefit sharing. At FLEDGE, our focus has been to support this particular process in addition to other works we do. But the last few months, we've been very specifically focusing on some of the new and emerging issues, to a large extent not particularly discussed and considered by the convention and its processes in general, but also by the conservation community in particular. And there are three specific elements we are working on at this moment. One, of course, is the entire issue of using design thinking and tools that are associated with the process to further support the conservation agenda. The second set of activities we are now working on is to mainstream and integrate learnings and experiences from social sciences into the conservation agenda, where we are focusing on two very specific issues. One is on the role of cognitive science in conservation, and the second one is the role of behavioral sciences in conservation. And many of you probably would have heard these terminologies. And during the 14th meeting of Conference of Parties to the Convention that was held in Egypt in November 2018, for the first time, countries actually called for more focus on social sciences-based initiatives and integrate some of those elements into the planning and implementation process of the convention. So we organized a side event during COP that focused on both design thinking as well as cognitive and behavioral sciences. And this particular webinar is a continuation of our discussion from Egypt, where several of the participants said that being a new area of focus for the conservation community, it would be a good idea to introduce what this is all about, how these areas of focus has immensely benefited several other spheres of activities, whether it is related to marketing, whether it is related to advertising, whether it is related to economics and social sciences immensely. But we still have challenges of using some of these tools, techniques, and thinking in the conservation world. The third area that we are specifically focusing on at FLEDGE is the role of emerging technology and sciences like blockchain technology, artificial intelligence, big data analytics in conservation. That includes issues of access and benefit sharing, traceability, and others related to that. So that's basically a background of why we are organizing this particular webinar. And during this particular session, which will last approximately about 40 to 45 minutes of presentation in two parts, where the first part would be led by my colleague, senior advisor to FLEDGE, and also a member of IUCN Commission on Education and Communication, is Deepta Satish, who will be the first presenter, who will introduce the subject of design thinking and also lay the foundations for my presentation on design thinking for conservation, which will follow our presentation. We are very grateful to IUCN Commission for Education and Communication, for which I act as the Regional Vice Chair for South and Southeast Asia, to have partnered with this particular webinar and the initiatives. And we hope that those of you who are interested to pursue activities related to education and communication would also join this global voluntary network of members that is open and free for further interests. So with that introduction, I'll now pass the presentation platform to my colleague Deepta Satish. So I'll end and I'll stop sharing this particular presentation from my side, and Deepta will now take over. Thank you. Deepta, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introductory webinar on design thinking for conservation, or design thinking for conservation futures. Thank you, Dr. Bala, for introducing me and for making this, pushing for this webinar to actually happen. And I'd also like to thank IUCN-CEC for supporting and encouraging this event. In addition to, just to quickly talk about one more association of mine, one is FLEDGE and IUCN-CEC. But in addition to that, and where a lot of the work that you will see in my part of the webinar is, I'm also director of the Design+Environment+Law Laboratory at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, where a lot of experimentation happens in the field with communities. And so a lot of the works that we're going to be going through today comes from the lab's explorations and experimentations in collaboration with scientists and lawyers, students, and humanities professionals and scholars. So, okay, so I will begin, but before we enter into how design and conservation are inextricably linked in my view, I'd like to ask the question first of what is design? Design, in my view and in my practice and in a lot of other people's as well, is really a practice of engaging in the world. It is a way of thinking and envisioning, and it is an act to initiate change in a desired future, such as sustainability and resilience. Therefore, design by nature is intuitive, creative, and imaginative. And this is not to say that design is just an artistic work driven by emotion or affect, but it is an everyday practice that can be understood, visualized, and framed towards the desired future. So, how does one engage, think, envision? How do we initiate change? And I think it really depends on how we see the world. There are many ways of seeing the world, and I believe there are three broad ways. One is if we see the world as a tangible and visible world of objects, which is really the world that we have constructed for ourselves as human beings. The second is an intangible world of processes and conflicts that we're constantly grappling with. And the third is an invisible field of possibilities and potentialities that is still left largely unexplored. So if we go into the field of the physical objects, the world can be said to be a field of nouns, buildings, books, cities, rivers. And I may be driven to see design as the shaping of form, composition, subtle juxtapositions, and so on. I could also reflect on the measures I bring to this act of design, which are beauty, comfort, efficiency, and instrumentality. However, one can also reflect on the meaning, history, cultural bias, and prejudices in these ideas and ask the question of indigenous alternatives. These alternatives begin to ask questions about progress, consumption patterns, quality of life of humans, but also of a material world of transformative movements of soil and water, changing patterns of weather, elements, migrations of birds and animals. These other ideas of alternatives require different understandings and not to pivot our ways of seeing on objects that align with the dominant practices of consumption. So in this particular field that we look at in terms of design for conservation, we focus on the other two ways of seeing, of trying to grapple with the intangible world and an invisible field. I can alternatively see the world as a field of processes and changes. Design here is concerned with being a verb, injecting itself as a process to improve processes. Here, the measure of design could well be development, progress, conservation, terms that could raise similar concerns for their meaning and cultural roots, their dominating power, the question of appropriate technology, practices, lifestyle, and so on. And in this manner, it becomes a field of actions that are questioned. Increasingly, a global trend has been to see the world as a field of conflicts and design as problem solving. A problem could be in a product, a practice, a material, the infrastructure of a city, such as garbage collection, or in communication. But design is here to improve lives through design of products, services, and systems. Much of the time, design is seen to borrow methodologies from other disciplines, the natural sciences, humanities and social sciences, history, geography, geology, meteorology, botany, and so on. But in my experience and view, design, particularly when engaging in the vulnerable environments that we're focusing on here, design actually gathers multiple disciplines and ecologies to make sense of the world in a complex manner so as to maintain the rich textures and dynamics of everyday life, particularly in sensitive and contentious landscapes. Here, system thinking is far too simplistic, and we need to engage in the complexity of places. Design for environment and resilient landscapes and communities is more about a search for truths that are left out, that are unseen, to be included in the narratives of places and given consideration when planning interventions of policy, plans, and changes on the ground. In environmental work, we usually design and construct the world around us through the understanding of development and conservation, broadly speaking. So, marking up the land in land uses and zones, looking at circulation and communication, open spaces and forests. Here we represent human habitat in 3 very simplified images or maps. In this process, we're dividing human from non-human, urban from rural, from jungle, productive landscapes from protected landscapes. And these are lines that divide our world. In places of dramatic natural and climatic flux, the lines become blurred. Many of these places are in the tropics, regions that are rich not only in culture and nature, but in resources. Large development projects transform these places dramatically in an attempt to homogenize landscape and displace its inhabitants. The recent floods in Kerala was not a natural disaster, but a design disaster of thoughtless over-design of development projects that disallow any local, natural, or cultural processes to persist in a synchronous manner with rain, rendering the ground loose and everything on its surface come down crumbling. What we need is to continually remind ourselves that nature, environment, and the weather cannot be controlled or precisely predicted. Nature cannot be contained and will always find its way in, through, over, across. So can we work with natural processes and enable or design change with them? Instead, if we begin with understanding an invisible field or possibilities rather than seeing from afar, but engaging in the environment, we can experience the environment without judgment. Being non-judgmental is critical to observing and understanding a complex ecology for what it is and not for what it should be or should not be. So, can we imagine a world where we draw lines that connect? This will involve a whole new way of seeing, a new paradigm, and a new imagination. To do this, we record a changing world, a changing ground, where we record change through multiple methods and media. We can then enter into a field of possibilities and potentialities. Can we imagine a world of interdependencies and synchronicity? This will involve a new imagination. The process is not to invent new realities, but to extract from existing places the invisible, the unheard, and the intangible. We look at lines of change of time, space, and materials that are constantly moving. And we need to research to uncover the invisible that requires blurring of boundaries of time and objects, blurring the boundaries of land and space, blurring the boundaries of water and soil to see fluidity. I will go through some project examples to demonstrate the value of some of these ideas, beginning with processes and problems and design for awareness, and then design for empowerment. The last section is design for policy, where we begin to look at inventing new paradigms that are pivoted on complex and dynamic landscapes and communities. I will be using visuals from projects conducted at the Design+Environment+Law Laboratory at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology over the past few years. In Design for Awareness, we explore visual narratives to not just produce materials, but using narrative as a methodology to research the complexity of environments and biodiversity. The terrain of the Western Ghats is one of the world's 8 hottest hotspots of biodiversity and some of the wettest regions where it rains for over 6 months in a year. This project is about communicating the issues of biodiversity, using scientific data and layering it with ideas of change of seasons, climate and monsoon, movements and interactions amongst creatures, ideas of co-inhabitants, and appropriations across time.
There were many different ways of collecting data in the form of visual narratives, such as these, and also in terms of visualizing scientific data. There was also explorations in visualizing experiences on the ground that include sensorial data, and then a process of organizing data into new categories of time and places and finding the lines of connection. The project considered and included changes that cannot be controlled: climate, rain, nature. These elements transform the landscape and our practices and patterns of behavior and transform any potential interventions. The storybook and visual mobile panel on summer settlers, winter wanderers, and monsoon migrants that came out of this exploration were created for an interpretation center for the public, as well as for activism to protect high-altitude grasslands in this region. The next project is another storybook designed to communicate the importance of biodiversity to the general public, particularly an urban public in India. This layered narrative, supported by the National Biodiversity Authority of India, is about a monkey who is in search of the tree that produced a sticker on an apple. The monkey journeys from a landfill through a potato farm, an apartment building, home to pigeons, and all the way to a supermarket in the city, collecting the stories of biodiversity across an urban scape, telling stories of monocultures and crop failure, and ideas of property and ownership. In the next example of Design for Empowerment, we look at environmental laws dealing with ideas of rights and justice, access to land and resources for indigenous people and local communities. The Indian Forest Rights Act of 2006 was designed to address the historical injustices to indigenous people in the hope of enabling them to live in their environment and protect it. In the sensitive region of Kutch, which is a complex matrix of desert, saltscapes, and marshes, the Maldaris are pastoral communities who herd camels and depend on them for sustenance and follow water. They had no idea that they had rights to remain in this terrain, and they could assert their rights to land and access to resources. This endeavor was not to just visualize the law or simplify it to communicate the text and its meanings, but also to enable communities to understand their rights in the context of their existing conflicts, which included the conflict with industries that were buying and bounding land near the coast and other areas that the camel pastoral communities graze and move through. A board game was designed with 2 pathways that continually intersect with each other, creating sites of conflict, one pathway of the Maldaris and the other of industries. It is a team game to enact collecting evidences to claim a right to continue to be an itinerant dweller of this terrain, or to claim property that is static. The next example is in the Srishti Tiger Reserve, a region that is peppered with small villages in the hills of North India in the Aravallis. Here, officials have been confiscating and imprisoning trespassing cows, making life difficult for the multitude of pastoral communities and forcing some of them to move out of the forest. This actually renders the environment much more vulnerable with no one to protect it. The project dealt with a different need here: to assist paralegals in finding strategies to help communities assert their rights and keep their cows as they traverse through grasslands and sacred groves in tiger country. A toolkit was designed that helped to communicate the processes of the Forest Rights Act and claiming rights and making decisions within communities and the villages themselves. It included a number of infographics, of which what you see is one example, and a puppet theater that enacts diverse scenarios and actors that the communities engage in the process of assertion of their rights. Now we enter a field of possibilities and potentialities. Where disciplinary boundaries inhibit us from seeing and engaging and acting as a local, we need to engage in a design practice to invent new data categories and methods of collecting and synthesizing data that maintain the complexities of ecologies, to be inclusive of all processes and inhabitants in a place, and responsive to dynamic local knowledge systems, and uncover socio-ecological relationships that build resilience in communities and landscapes. So now we go back into the Western Ghats and consider this changing landscape. Here you see only two photographs, a wet moment and a dry moment. For the inhabitants, it is a gradient of wetness. It is a slower process that they adapt to and move with. They don't see this top view either. They're not above the land, but are in it, part of it, and creating it. So can we reimagine our position? Can we make an attempt to be an insider, an inhabitant, rather than viewing from an outsider above? In order to do this, we have created two kinds of lenses. One, to investigate the qualities of places, of ideas of porosity, wetness, permeability, threshold. We have also begun to record and make sense of places while actively engaging in the field, recording experiences in this terrain on foot. To observe the conditions of places and their multiple qualities across time, scales, and practices, and their interrelationships. This way of observing through touch, smell, sight, sound, and other kinds of knowing is designed to develop perceptions as an inhabitant, not as an outsider. It is designed to be a local, to be inclusive and responsive. To be the inhabitant is not to be the scientist or the designer or the ethnographer or the lawyer. Through these methods, we can actually understand the diversity of landscapes and the environmental forces that continually shape them. The first example we look at is a piece of work titled A Field of Traces. Here we understand the multiplicity of practices, places, and people, that traces are made by practices on the ground. The top third of the visuals are photographs. The middle are the extraction of traces from these photographs, and the lowest portion that you see are actually practices that create these traces on the ground. The visualizations reveal a gradient of traces left by practices from permanent to ephemeral. Through these visual assemblages, we can see that not all practices are harmful or leave permanent marks, but are actually temporal. For example, indigenous people in local communities engage in practices that are sensitive to the environment and only for their subsistence. These are ephemeral. With this study, we can actually challenge ideas of boundaries that keep local communities, lions, and other things inside the confines of a forest or a sanctuary, when they are actually one with nature. We can use this study to redefine boundaries and design porous, temporal, and soft places to negotiate through. In the final set of visuals, we see the landscape as a field of movements, in search of movement of things and stillness. Here we construct an entanglement of habitats, a meshwork of continual formations and emerging actions of movements. If we want to document local ways of knowing, we first need to challenge existing categories that communities do not know or understand, and need to invent new ways of seeing that are derived from a ground understanding. This involves observing movements and recording and extracting data, and these are all visual processes. And then the idea of abstracting data. Here, one needs to maintain a level of curiosity as one goes through the process of design to discover something new, something unknown to the eye. And understanding the complexity and operations of movement, that it's not one thing that moves, but different kinds of movements that make a thing. This can be seen when synthesizing data. And the final result is really creating a new taxonomy and language to create new measures that is inclusive of change across time. And here what you see are 26 different kinds of movements categorized in 4 different taxonomical categories: signaling, negotiating, navigating, and wandering. So we have very quickly skimmed across a number of ideas, examples, contexts, and conflicts. The idea here is to get a broad sense of how design can contribute towards conservation futures,
and how to do conservation better rather than just depending on existing frameworks that tend to limit a lot of conservation action on the ground. So in this light, the areas of impact for design thinking and imagination in the field of environment and ecology are in pedagogy or environmental education, conservation practice, and policy making. And a lot of the work and experiments that have been done in this lab so far touch upon education, policy impact, culture and development, looking at resilience thinking, democratizing law, and beginning to look at conflict resolution as well. There are a number of areas of experimentation that have begun but are also much more open-ended, looking at ways of doing field research, data creation, methods of synthesis, representing nature. How do we even think and represent and see nature? And one of the most important things that we hope to impact through this new endeavor of design thinking for conservation is this large gap between policymakers and the communities. And the areas of research that a lot of this work starts to maneuver through are ideas of rights and justice, ideas of marginality, notions of development and progress, sustainability and resilience, and blurring boundaries between nature and culture so that we can actually be closer to it. And finally, we ask the question again, what is design? Design by nature is intuitive, creative, and imaginative. Design is a practice of engaging in the world, a way of thinking and envisioning, and a way to act, to initiate change in a desired future. If design is creative, then it must be inclusive of everything that can make it relevant, inclusive of all that can make it and all that it can make. It must be responsive to a context, the environment, to change, to dynamics. It must also be participative of the entities that intersect with it. So in a place, we need to include the interrelationships amongst practices of people, habitats, the plant and animal life that may co-inhabit it, the wind, the sun, the moon, and the rain, and how they influence each other, not to focus on them as objects that are static. So to conclude, I'd like to suggest that design is an attitude, a sensibility, and a critique. It is about imaging and reimagining the new in whatever be the kind of worldview, whether it's a process, conflict, event, practice, or possibility, and perhaps all of them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Deepta. I think that was a very good introduction, relatively new for a lot of people who actually have been working on the issue of conservation. And as Deepta was mentioning, even though design thinking currently is being used extensively globally by various different disciplines, mostly from the corporate sector, mainly in terms of reaching out to consumers, changing consumer behavior, creating value for products, and a large number of related applications. This particular area of thinking, this particular practice has been relatively new for conservation. But for those of us who've been working in the field, including like people like Deepta, we've been using elements of design thinking to a certain extent, especially for those of us who have been working with communities in terms of governance issues, empowerment issues, human rights issues, and all that. We've been actually using elements of this particular framework extensively, but we actually never finessed the components, the process, the elements, and the tools that are available and researched in a better and an impactful way. So our intent of focusing on this particular issue of FLEDGE is to provide an opportunity for the conservation community in terms of understanding the entire process, assess the tools that are available, and make use of them, essentially to understand and appreciate an issue as complex as conservation or biodiversity futures or conservation futures, but also to simplify and reach out to a larger number of non-conservationists. And that has always been a challenge for a lot of us working in the conservation field. So what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to quickly take you through the current discussions and debates in terms of the conservation community. And for those of us who work in conservation, we constantly hear some of these messages in the recent months and weeks. And essentially the outcomes of the COP14 meeting in Egypt has been a lot of doubts that are raised in terms of our ability to achieve the current 2020 Aichi biodiversity targets. We are just about to complete a decade of our commitment that we made in 2010 to achieve a set of targets to reduce the rate of loss of biodiversity and also support sustainable development. We're also hearing a lot of messages like we're going to produce more litter, pollution is going to increase, and we are going to be losing biodiversity every minute. And for those of you who actually have had a look at the Living Planet report, the WWF report, one of the real sort of problematic messages that have come out of that particular report is that we lost 60% of the biodiversity in the last 50 years. Very worrisome trend. But certainly these are the common messages that the general public is going to be hearing most of the times, thanks to media, thanks to some of the workshops, awareness programs, and things like that. And the key challenges in terms of how we still are not able to make an impact of our actions collectively, globally, are quite a few. But this does not mean that there are a large number of small successes or islands of success that are happening in conservation. A large number of them happen all through the day, all through the year, in many parts of the world. Whether it is our ability to designate a larger number of protected areas, our ability to designate more marine protected areas, our ability to communicate biodiversity better, our ability to deal with national strategies on biodiversity conservation. So we do have had a large number of successes, both at local level, national, as well as at the international level. But we still are challenged with this idea of what has been the collective impact of these actions. So the key challenges in terms of the actions that we are faced with, the biggest problem still for a lot of us working in conservation is the lack of understanding of the value of biodiversity by the common man. And for those of you who follow the conservation agenda, I'm sure you would have read a lot about this in terms of why such valuing biodiversity, not valuation of biodiversity, but valuing biodiversity is extremely important, especially from different stakeholder groups, so that the ownership of securing the ecosystems, the services of the ecosystems, the biodiversity becomes an agenda that is owned by just not ministries of environment or those negotiating the convention, but by the gentleman, general public, the children, the housewives, and people out there. The second challenge is that in spite of all our efforts for the last whatever number of years, the drivers of biodiversity loss, whether it is the habitat destruction, whether it is impact of invasive species, all of these drivers are significantly impacting and their impacts are increasing. And that is also a key challenge. To an extent, this actually is also linked to the way decisions are made by those people or those kinds of actions that push some of these drivers to cause loss of biodiversity. So it's an issue of not knowing the value of the resource ecosystems and biodiversity. It is also an attitudinal issue. It is also a cognitive and behavioral issue. And that's where people's behavior still is a bit of a problem. And I'll give you just one or two examples to showcase on how people's behavior is impacting in ways which many of us do not even understand or do not even recognize as an important factor to consider to have a successful conservation agenda. And lastly, environment and conservation agenda is still not seen as a citizen agenda. It is still seen as an agenda of a few people, mainly working in ministries of environment, and to a large extent, environment is always challenged and seen as a kind of a detrimental factor for countries and stakeholders to actually work on development that looks at both social and economic angles. So these are some of the key challenges within which we currently are working to develop a new set of strategic plan and a new set of targets starting 2021 to 2030. And I'm going to give you one example in terms of how people's perception and behavior is so very important for us to define the elements and scope of the future biodiversity global framework. In the US, they actually did a quick assessment and survey in terms of how they were able to message to people in a particular community in terms of their ability to make use of some interventions related to energy and energy conservation as a contribution to both climate mitigation as well as other aspects of it. So they actually looked at 4 different signs or 4 different messages that they used to talk to people and make them understand and believe that energy conservation is going to be a good thing to do. So the first message or the first sign they've had was that they informed the customers that they could be saving $54 on their utility bill. A very common, economically powerful message, essentially for those who actually look at the economics of interventions. Then they actually had to another set of people, the second message or the second sign, where they told the customers that they could prevent the release of pounds of greenhouse gases every month if they actually changed to an alternate way of managing the energy. They actually encouraged customers that saving energy was a socially responsible thing to do. And lastly, they also let customers know that 77% of their neighborhood already actively are using fans to save energy. So there are 4 of these messages that were actually given to the customers. And very interestingly, if any of us would have looked at an impact of this, our choice of the best possible behavioral change that would have gotten a better result would probably message number 1 or sign number 1, because it talks about saving some money. But surprise, surprise, when they did an assessment of which was the most impactful message they were able to give, it actually was this 4th message that said that 77% of the neighbors are already actively using fans to save energy. So this actually, in technical terms, is what is called social proofing a message. And currently in conservation and biodiversity areas, we still have not started using social proofing as a key area to impact the attitudes, behavior, and cognitive elements of people out there. So in that order, in terms of more people, more neighbors are using it, then second one was saving money, third one was protecting the environment, and the last one was making responsible choices. So to a certain extent, this actually is an example in terms of how the way we think and the way we actually communicate what we think is definitely a kind of an issue that needs to be focused by the conservation community as and when we move forward for the future biodiversity conservation agenda. So dealing with conservation strategy for the future, it always deals with uncertainties because we do not know what is going to be the impact of climate change, habitat destruction, invasive species, and all of it on conservation. And we are also trying to use the uncertainties to get a decisive comparative advantage. But the challenge here from another angle is that if you take, for example, illegal or illicit trade that is impacting biodiversity, definitely one of the key elements that we need to consider is just not about people being aware of the need for conservation, but there is also another social element related to that, that as long as there is a demand and scarcity for these products and these kinds of species, illegal trade will continue. So that is a key element. The second thing is that we have tried whatever we can in terms of communicating the importance of biodiversity locally, nationally, and globally, but we still have found that our narrative is relatively weak. Still people are not able to understand, they're not buying our apprehensions of the kind of dangers the planet is going to be facing. So it is very important that now we are going to get the narrative a little different. And is there a narrative on a continued loss of biodiversity having a resonance with public? We still do not know. If you're going to ask a taxi driver, if you're going to ask a school child or a housewife, that biodiversity is being lost at that percentage, or so many species are lost every minute or every day, the first reaction would be, yeah, so how is it going to be affecting me? And if you look at the social angle of it, people are earning more money, they are getting better facilities, they have more diversity of food, whether the diversity is nutritious or not is a different thing, but they have access to food which probably they never had it before. So to a certain extent, the biggest challenge we have is that on one hand, we are saying biodiversity is being lost, and it is going to be detrimental to the planet, people are going to be suffering. But on a given day, for a given individual, the impact is still not being felt. And that is where the narrative has to be different when it comes to conservation action. So if tomorrow somebody is going to be looking at design thinking approach, and somebody is going to be coming up with an idea saying that it's okay to lose biodiversity, so far we can limit our future wounds. And of course, from a conservation expert side or a conservation community, there will be riots if I'm going to say it is okay to lose biodiversity. But then you have to read the second part of the sentence, which says that so far we limit our future wants. So our wants are increasing, and if you want to increase or keep our wants to the current or the future needs, it is not okay to use biodiversity. And that is where a kind of an approach like design thinking comes into play a role in how do we communicate such a kind of a simplistic message of a very complex problem. So I'm going to give you just one example where design thinking has been very extensively applied from the climate change convention's perspective. And this set of activities started immediately after Copenhagen. And many of you who follow the climate negotiations understand that Copenhagen was one of the most difficult climate curves with very limited positive outcomes. So people actually have started using design thinking to say that how is that we're going to communicate climate change differently and use different approaches to deal with this entire thing. So they actually found a particular initiative called the Living Climate Change, where they actually asked three very simple questions. What will you do for the future of climate change? How will you support sustainability? And what does climate change mean to you? And what they did was that they said that do not design a product to answer these questions, but develop a narrative and a story to support social activism. And that is where design thinking comes into play a very, very important role. It is very fine for us to say that countries need to develop a financing plan to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets or the 2021 to 2030 biodiversity targets. But having a financing plan is only a product. But what completely we are missing is that we still are not developing the narratives. We are not developing a story, and we are not actually putting it in the social activism mode so that the ownership of raising the resources, sustaining the resources, deploying the resources belongs to everyone, where the sustainability of our actions becomes better. So the result of this particular activity that used design thinking was that a video was produced by a family in the United Kingdom. This was randomly done. Several families participated in this particular discussion, in this particular initiative, in which mothers read their children climate scenarios, asking their children what they would do to respond to climate change. And the results of it, the ages of the children were not provided, but the reactions of the children were widely shared. And it was astounding to look at how the children were able to relate their future existence to what is happening in their day-to-day life, whether it is related to floods, whether it is related to drought, or whether it is related to extreme weather patterns, especially in the UK in the last few years and things like that. And that actually led to a complete new way of communicating how to deal with climate change adaptation and mitigation if you're going to be talking to a non-expert. The second one was that IBM presented to a high school the notion of environmental security and scenario following the aftermath of the superstorm Sandy. And what they did, again using design thinking as a base, was that they gave two scenarios in terms of having a massive flooding in the urban community and an unseasonal drought in a rural farming community. And the question they asked was that how might we be able to deal with some of these challenges using design solutions in the context of climate change. The results were not to look at technical interventions, not to just look at scientific theories, not to look at predictive models, but the strongest element of surprise or support came from the participating students, where they actually had three fundamental requirements for us to deal with climate change. One, the need for trust. Second, strong community partners. And third, open communication. So to a certain extent, the results of this have been extensively used and mainstreamed by various agencies who actually have been working on some of these issues from the climate portfolio. I'm going to give you a second example. This was not done by design in terms of having a design thinking approach, but it just happened as a default, was that in 2012, Government of India, Ministry of Environment was looking at developing a new set of national targets on biodiversity. And traditionally, it's the Ministry of Environment that actually develops these senses to different ministries, get their inputs and finalize it. But then, I was chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority at that time, where he said that let's actually get it done through the National Planning Agency, the National Planning Commission. The reason being that the National Planning Commission works with almost all the government departments, ministries, and agencies, but they're also responsible for allocation of financial resources to different agencies for a 5-year planning period. So when we started discussing it at the level of a planning agency, which brings together different ministries, agencies together, the focus traditionally has been on what Ministry of Agriculture is doing for conservation, what Ministry of Rural Development is doing for conservation, what Ministry of Health is doing for conservation. But then we actually changed the narrative to actually say that these are the extra things you need to do, these are the things which you're already doing, and this is the kind of an investment which you're already making, and how do you strengthen that particular agenda a little further. So it actually have had a significant change in the way ministries have started looking at biodiversity, because to a certain extent, they are not being burdened by asking them to do something on top or new to whatever they are doing. So to a certain extent, the discussions we have had, the kind of initiatives we have put together to develop the new set of targets for the Government of India under the National Action Plan for Biodiversity that is currently being implemented, was essentially to look at design thinking approaches to deal with conservation. And I did mention about the People's Biodiversity Register, so I'm not going to repeat anything what she said, but essentially currently the way People's Biodiversity Registers that are being developed in India as a kind of a rights-based approach for communities to seek ownership of the resource that they have, both in the context of conservation, sustainable use and management, but also in the context of equitable sharing of benefits. When somebody uses or accesses this material, is very tops down, is very technical and very scientific. So currently we have developed a few thousand such People's Biodiversity Registers in India, developed by scientists, developed by universities, developed by NGOs, which are checklists of names of plants where they occur and which village is hosting them. And these are published and these are kept in shelves. But currently, what in association and in partnership with Srishti and Rita, with FLEDGE, what we're doing is that we actually are trying to completely get a new narrative to the People's Biodiversity Registers, where they actually become a living document and the communities actually have these registers, not just printed, bound and kept in a cupboard, but as a kind of a tool, as a kind of a resource available in front of their eyes, day to day, to see them, to manage them, to provide access and get benefit from using those resources. So we already have developed a whole set of toolkit and an approach models developed by the students of Srishti, and we'll be launching some of them fairly soon. Again, an issue of how we can look at design thinking in doing something new. So what we're looking at currently is a kind of a storm of complexity. You have on one hand, negotiators, scientists, policymakers, and ministries who are actually trying to define the future 10 years of biodiversity conservation globally, but that needs to be translated into implementation at the national level. But then we are all working on this in a cup of a perfect storm of complexity. The rates of changes are increasing, the connectivities are decreasing, the convergency is being lost. We have huge demand in terms of biodiversity from the consumers, and it is turning out to be a major challenge to humanity. So we need multiple actions and approaches, and we need for better design, and we need to deal with both the value and the action link needs to be done. So in terms of how we're going to be using the design thinking for the post-2020 process is to focus on the user's experiences, including the emotional ones, create models to examine complex problems. Dita did explain with one or two examples on how it can be simplified and made use of both in terms of visual based approaches as well as action based approaches. We also need a lot of prototypes. Unless you demonstrate, it is not going to be accepted. So it's a demo or a die kind of a situation for us when we are working on the future of the conservation agenda. So we need quite a few prototypes. We have to be inclusive. We have to act differently. And we have to use design thinking approaches for individual components of the goals and targets. So design thinking is an essential tool for understanding complex situations, simplifying approaches, and humanizing the outcomes. So from FLEDGE, our intent is that we actually will be now making use of this approach and will be coming up with a set of training modules and toolkits where we'll be introducing some of these kinds of approaches at 3 different phases. One, at the level of planning and designing the new strategic plan and the targets. The second one, through the open working group in drafting these targets. And third one is in terms of the negotiation actions that will happen from now on until 2020, when China will be hosting the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties. So that's basically my presentation, and thank you for your attention. And I've given my mail ID on that particular slide. You can make note of it. So if you have any questions, clarifications, or if you want some training material, or if you want to participate in the future webinars or receive the recording of this particular presentation, please send an email to that particular mail ID. Thank you very much. Now, I'll open it up for question and answers. You can unmute your microphones. My suggestion is that we take one question, one by one, and you can specify whether the question is addressed to me or to Deepta as and when you ask your questions, but would appreciate if you can introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, can I go first?
Please, Sandeep.
Yeah, so I'm a project officer at Oxfam India, and I basically look at energy access in forest landscapes of Odisha, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh. I'd heard about this design thinking and the importance of design and development space, but I have to admit this sounded a little esoteric for me. But I get the idea and the thoughts behind it. My question is, what it seems to me is it is going to be a very top-down approach. I mean, I'm wondering how can people at the grassroots will be a part of it. I mean, this design thinking can be administered, or it seems like it will be administered on a very top-down approach, and all the low-level communities can do is be a participant or somebody who can receive those designs. But I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how they will engage in this in a better way. I don't know if I'm all over the place, but that's.
I think maybe I could start the response to Sandeep's question. Sandeep, I think there might be a slight misunderstanding of what the presentation, at least my part of it, might have been. It's actually the opposite, that it's not meant to be top-down at all, and usually design and other kinds of investigators or researchers come in from the outside and try to come in with a very specific view from their own backgrounds and disciplines, and examine and judge and evaluate places and communities and sensitive landscapes. The idea here is to actually engage in places with communities and potentially understand from their side how they know what they know, and try to extract ideas from that so that we can be more inclusive of the community's perspective. So it's really, I think, one of the things that's essential for design thinking in the space of conservation and environmental issues is engagement on the ground with communities, and to learn from them rather than using frameworks that are external. And I think that art and design actually has the ability to listen and begin to understand multiple ideas of cultures and practices that communities actually engage in. And most communities who, communities that are on the ground, and we've also worked in Orissa, in that part of India, we realize that communities don't articulate their knowledge. They don't they're not used to saying, here's what I learned and here's what you're going to learn. And they don't tell their children they don't tell their children about knowledge. What we do is it's more practice-based, right? So communities collect non-timber forest produce, and children learn by watching their parents. The idea with design and art and design practices is to actually observe how this happens, so that we can actually translate some of these ways of knowing to impact policy. That's really it in a short nutshell, but we can go into it in more detail if that was not clear.
Let me just add, the example that I mentioned about the People's Biodiversity Register has been that the current way the register is being developed is a very tops-down one. It's a very technical bit of work. A set of researchers go there with a questionnaire, they ask people on what plants are used, what are the names of these plants, how long you've been using it, and then prepare a list, and that becomes PBR. Whereas when we use this particular approach, it was completely different because it's not the register per se in terms of a catalog of species and the uses of these species, but it's a whole lot of things associated with the species that the communities are able to articulate and put better, so that it's just not a static documentation of information in the form of a bound book, but actually it is a compendium of practices, knowledge, and approaches to dealing with local biodiversity and local uses. So as Deepta said, that probably should have been a little bit more clearer, but Sandeep, I think it's just exactly the opposite. It's more bottoms-up approach in terms of process.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Deepta and Balakrishnan.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? You can unmute the microphone to ask the question.
Yes.
One question. I'm Akriti. I have a question for Deepta. Deepta, you mentioned about the hard lines between a lot of things that we see as urban or rural, and these hard lines that we see between things. So the one example I can think of is conservation and development. So when we implement these ideas and our approaches towards conservation, can we also blur that line a little bit and see that as development also, that whatever development seems to be right now, by applying our way of design thinking and using this as a tool for development, can we see that as something which can be used for development and not just conservation?
I think that's a very good question. Thank you, Akriti. I think one of the, I believe that, right now we are, the world that we see, or the way of seeing, actually is constructed towards primarily development activities. And conservation has sort of come up as a response to overdevelopment and deterioration of natural environments and habitats and biodiversity loss. And so instead of building something that is only reacting to development, the idea here in this endeavor is really to sort of find ways in which communities who have knowledge, this is just one example, that communities who already have knowledge of how to do conservation, and they probably don't even think it's called conservation, they're just doing their everyday life, their everyday practices. But can we learn from them in how to be more sensitive and putting less pressure on the environment in that sense? So I believe that if we're able to find new frameworks from understanding these local communities and how they think and how they actually practice their everyday lives in a sensitive manner, there are ways to blur the boundaries between conservation and development, but use that framework to encourage sensitive development. Right now, it's about over-design, over-development, too much infrastructure. We have too many floods because of that. We have all kinds of climate change activities. And of course, a lot of the environmental humanities folks will say this is the age of the Anthropocene. But moving away from just the theoretical framework, in the practical end, it is not, I mean, the line between development and conservation on the ground is the line between city and forest, or fields and forest, or fields and city. And I think we do need to start blurring those, but how do we blur those boundaries is the question. You can't just have a buffer zone that becomes this midway transition space. And I think that is still a developmental framework that comes from a more capitalistic neoliberal perspective. But can we sort of soften those things a little bit to really include environment and the natural processes? So that's really the agenda. And there isn't a framework yet, but I think in the process of engaging in design thinking and design research, the idea is to begin to construct a new framework in the next, few months and a couple of years. So, thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Deepta. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, hi, this is Falguni Gupta.
Yes, Falguni.
I've been seeing a lot of practices. Right now, I and Akriti have been working together, and we do try to, understand the practices of people in the context and try to understand how there is our daily practices for them, which we see as conservation practices. But if we talk about the forest departments or any such government organization, they don't see it in such a way. And according to them, they are just doing opposite of what their notion of conservation is. So, what is your take on how conservation is perceived by different organizations, different kind of people, different professions, and the people who are living over there?
Right. I mean, you're right. Because, see, normally what happens is that a lot of these perspectives depends on your background, your training, your approach, and your job. Maybe for a community, the way they want to manage the value of biodiversity or ecosystem services, or NF, is definitely different from the way a forester is going to be looking at. It will be different from the way the ministry will be looking at it. It will be different from the way a business practitioner will be looking at it. So certainly that's a given, and that kind of inbuilt bias is a part of all of us. But what is important is not so much to look at that, but to look at how collectively these approaches can be used in terms of supporting development, supporting conservation. So that way, from a forest department's view, the main intention is to protect what is available and ensure that nothing being lost, nothing is being pilfered and taken away. So to a large extent, their approach is to ensure that nobody goes and touches anything in a forest. But what they do not understand is that biodiversity that is not used is biodiversity not being there. So unless you're going to be using biodiversity, unless you're going to be strengthening the ecosystem approaches or the provisioning services of ecosystems and things, there is no point in actually having a large force trying to protect. So what is fundamentally required is a kind of an attitudinal and a behavioral change, number one. And that is where design thinking comes in, because to a large extent, when communities, forest departments, NGOs, and government officials meet, each one of them have a different narrative and a different agenda and a different approach to deal with conservation. But using the approaches that are a part of design thinking, it makes the boundaries quite blurred, and we'll be able to bring different people together onto the same platform. So to an extent, it also discusses the behavioral and attitudinal issues also. And that is why this kind of an approach is offered.
Thank you. If nobody is asking, I have one more question to ask.
Sure.
So the much talked sustainable development goals and how NITI Aayog is taking the whole project and trying to implement it in terms of India and then bifurcating it in different agendas. So my question is, how just is the way NITI Aayog is working towards such a big term?
How just? It's a bit of a loaded question. No. I mean, what do you mean by how just? Can you explain that bit of the question? When you say how just, what they're doing is how just?
Yeah, by saying how just, I mean the way they have documented or just pinpointed one or two goals and targets, and then made a tabular form of all the states and say that okay, we have achieved this much target and we are beyond this. And currently, in which they have tried to put them in 3 categories, all the states. So in that way.
Okay. So I'll just sort of rephrase your question in terms of, are the approaches of Niti Aayog inclusive? Right. See, the thing is that you have to basically understand 2 dimensions to this particular question. One is that when actually you're looking at preparing a national report of what countries are doing towards achieving the elements of the Sustainable Development Goals to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, they basically work only on data and information of who is doing what is being done, what are the numbers, because that is easily understood and that is what the reports contain. But what is required is in preparation of it, which is transmitted to the global audience, which is a responsibility of Niti Aayog. What is important is to engage with different stakeholders from the local communities to those working in the Ministry of Statistics and the technical ministries who provide the data and information to Niti Aayog. So to a certain extent, Niti Aayog is more a kind of a compiler of information than generating information on their own. First part. The second bit of it is that FLEDGE, we actually worked on a framework specifically for India, but now it is being used in a few other countries, is that how do you localize sustainable development? So in other words, what kind of indicators, what kind of actions, what kind of approaches are needed at the local level to translate the national targets, the national goals, and the indicators to achieve sustainable development at the local level. So the intent of providing that framework, which now has been used or agreed to be a part of the Gram Panchayat development plans in India through the Ministry of Panchayat Raj, where they are using this particular framework, is exactly to be inclusive in terms of looking at a bottoms-up approach of dealing with not just the kind of activities that happen, but also reporting on what is happening on the ground.
Thank you.
Good. Are there any further questions? Akriti, I see you. Do you want to ask a question?
No.
Okay, thank you. Okay, looks like there are no further questions. Thank you very much for being a part of this particular session. And both on my behalf and also on behalf of Deepta Satish, thank you for your interest. And as I mentioned, we'll have a recording of this particular presentation that will be available. If you're interested, please send a mail either to me or to Deepta, and we'll be more than happy to share this. And we'll keep you posted of the next set of webinars, which will be a little bit more in terms of training oriented than an introductory kind of webinar, where we'll be focusing on some very specific examples and issues in the future sessions. Deepta, if you have any closing remark, floor is yours.
No, that's all from me too. Thank you very much. I think I'm pretty glad to have seen a few participants in this one and engaged ones too. And I enjoyed the questions as well that were asked from Sandeep to Akriti and Falguni as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, colleagues, and have a good day, have a good evening, you're connecting from. Thank you. Thanks a lot.